Hello and welcome back to our next research methods lesson. We've looked at questionnaires and today we're going to start looking at interviews as our second main research method. So let's get started. So the first thing that you need to make a note of is the different types of interviews. You can start looking at there. We've got a structured interview and unstructured interview. Those are your main two types. And then you've got this kind of thing called a group interview, which is less important, less common, but you still need to know about it. A structured interview is a bit of a funny one. It's basically the same as a questionnaire. It's exactly the same as a questionnaire. There's a list of questions, usually closed, written on a sheet of paper. The only difference is rather than the participant filling them out themselves, there's an interviewer there who reads the questions and then writes down the responses. Now, an unstructured interview is probably what more likely what you guys have in your head when you think about an interview. It's much more informal. It's much more like a conversation between two people, the researcher and the participant. It's open, it's flowing. There's lots of different questions. There's space for the participant to give lots more answers and lots more depth and detail. And a key part of this is building what's called a rapport. Which is a bond of trust, and that helps the participant open up and be honest in their responses. The researcher will have a kind of general topic in mind, but there aren't set questions. There's not a written list that they have to stick to, and if something comes up that they find interesting, they can ask new questions and go and take it in a different direction. So that's an unstructured interview. Now, a group interview is, as it sounds, an interview involving a larger group of people. So it's not a one-to-one situation, usually about 8 to 10 participants. And that again is much more like an open conversation or a discussion about a particular topic. The researcher will be there guiding that topic, but not really asking direct questions or leading that discussion. They'll just be kind of trying to keep them on track a little bit. Okay, so make a note of those three types of interview. Okay, now we need to consider the strengths and weaknesses of these structured interviews using our acronym PERVERT again. Key thing with this is you can use a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses that we did for questionnaires. So for example, it's relatively quick and simple to create the questions because they're all closed questions. You write essentially a questionnaire and then the researcher will basically read those out. So it's relatively quick and simple to create. It's quick and simple to analyze the results. It's usually quantitative data, so it's quick to kind of analyze those results and make some statistics. There aren't many ethical issues like deception or lack of informed consent. So you can use a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses from the questionnaires, and it'd be worth noting some of those down on the note sheet now. But the key thing you've got to do here is you've got to think about the fact that a researcher is present, how that changes a structured interview from a questionnaire. The fact that there's someone physically in the room, what difference that might make. And there's a couple of strengths and weaknesses that I want you to make a note of. So firstly, a strength of having the interviewer there in the room compared to a questionnaire when they're not and you're just filling it out at home is that if there's any questions you don't understand, you can ask them to kind of clarify what the question means. And what that does then is that improves the validity. So a structured interview could be argued as more valid than a questionnaire because the researcher can clarify, or this word means that, or the question's asking about this, and that helps the participant then. But there's a problem as well. The problem is that having the researcher in the room could mean that you're more likely to lie, like there's more pressure to give socially desirable answers, like you don't want to look bad to the researcher. When you're doing a questionnaire, you're on your own at home, so that's less of an issue. But when you're in the room and the researcher is physically in the room, it's a chance that you might lie. So again, you could argue that the validity is actually lower doing a structured interview than a questionnaire. Now, another weakness is a practical factor, is that it will take longer. When I've written my set of questions, if I'm doing a questionnaire, I can just send those out and all my participants can be getting on with those at the same time. Whereas if it's a structured interview, I actually physically need someone there to read the questions out and record the answers. That's obviously going to take a lot longer than just sending the questionnaires out. Finally, what you do get though is addressing one of the weaknesses of a questionnaire is because there's a researcher present, there's a physical person. It's a lot harder to say no to. You don't get quite the same kind of level of response rate. Questionnaires, a lot of people just ignore them, whereas structured interviews are much harder to ignore, so you get a higher response rate. So practically, there's a weakness of structured interviews compared to questionnaires, but there's also a strength. It's more likely to get a higher response rate, which means you're not wasting your time quite as much. So make a note of those different strengths and weaknesses, and also make a note of just some general weaknesses and strengths of questionnaires that also apply to structured interviews. And then we'll move on to the next bit. Now, Young and Wilmot provide a really good example of this structured interview. The key thing going on here is that they wanted to interview a reasonably large sample to get representative data. So they tried to get around about 1,000 people, 933 people, to respond to their research. They wouldn't have been able to do it if it was a unstructured interview, because you need specialist training and you need a really good level of skill to do an unstructured interview. What they did, because the questions were set and it was just exactly the same each time, they hired some people to do the interviews for them. They gave them a little bit of training, but because it was very simple and very easy to complete, all they had to do was ring up the appropriate participant and then basically tick boxes in response to the answers. And it only took, each interview was anywhere between 10 minutes and half an hour. They wouldn't have been able to do it if it was just the two of them. But because they're able to hire in other people, and because it was a relatively simple process, they managed to get a much larger sample and much more representative sample. So you've got issues there of practical issues, making it easier than an unstructured interview, and you've got more representative, the issue of representativeness, that this example can be used to support. So make a note of Young and Wilmot's research. It was their research into the family and symmetrical family. Make a note of that on the note sheet, please. All right, moving on, we've got to talk about group interviews. Now, again, you can use a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses from the other ones. In particular, you can take the strengths and weaknesses from unstructured interviews, which we're about to talk about, and apply them to group interviews. But the key thing that I want you to be paying attention to is the fact that there's a large group of participants, that it's not a one-to-one situation. How is that going to make a difference to the research? So we're going to have a look at a couple of strengths, a couple of weaknesses to really pick that up. Now, when there's a larger group of people, the other people being present, big thing that can take place is that it increases the social desirability effect. What that means is, there's lots more people who you might be afraid of judging you for your answers, and so you feel more pressure to kind of conform to normal or desirable answers. And that lowers the validity. You're less likely to be honest in that situation, so the research is not getting accurate results. In a one-to-one situation, in an unstructured interview, you can build a good relationship and there's less people around. You might feel that you're more honest and open and able to share. In a group interview, that's less likely. But there is a way that group interviews can increase the validity. What you can do, because there's lots of people sharing their ideas, sharing experiences or opinions, that might trigger or prompt other people to share even more. So you might get more data. Whereas in a one-to-one situation, you might find that they run out of things to say. In a group interview, one of the benefits is that you can all kind of bounce off of each other and create more data. So that way you get a fuller picture of the topic that you're looking at, and that actually increases validity. It's a validity issue. As well, if you imagine interviewing, let's say you want to interview 100 people, if you're doing one at a time, it's going to take a long time. If you do them in groups of 10, then you're done a lot quicker. So practically speaking, group interviews can be better than unstructured interviews. But a problem with that is that when you put people in a group, and you'll know from your lessons as well, often when there's a group discussion, you've got one or two people that dominate the conversation. There's one or two people that take up the majority of the conversation. And so it's only really their ideas that are being shared, not the groups. And that means, again, you're not actually getting the kind of larger sample, the more representative sample. You're ending up with just one or two people. At that point, you might as well do an unstructured interview anyway. So there's a couple of different strengths, a couple of different weaknesses that you need to make a note of, and then once we finish looking at unstructured interviews, you can put some of those strengths and weaknesses into the group interviews section as well. So now we're going to start looking at the kind of main part of the method here, the unstructured interviews. And funnily enough, I met my wife when I was doing some unstructured interviews. I asked her the question, I said, "Are you a camera?" She said, "What?" So, "Are you a camera?" Because every time I look at you, I smile. And the next day we got married. So we're going to look at some practical factors. We're going to look at some ethical factors. Practically speaking, what we're saying about unstructured interviews is actually they take quite a lot of time. Okay, it's like a conversation. There's a lot of space for the participants to open up, to give depth and detail. That's a really important part of unstructured interviews, but it does mean it takes a long time. And because it produces qualitative data, so opinions and depth, it's not statistics, it also will take a long time to analyze. Generally speaking, we're talking about quite an impractical method when it comes to time. On top of the kind of time element is the idea that really, in order to complete and conduct unstructured interviews, you need to have a bit of training. You need to have some good skills. There's a lot of key elements to it, like being able to build a rapport, about asking the right questions, and helping the participants kind of share their views without forcing them to talk about one thing or another that they don't really want to talk about. So there's a decent amount of training. You only want kind of specially qualified people to do unstructured interviews. And again, that's a practical issue because either the researcher has to have those skills themselves, or they need to hire someone in who's got those skills. And that's going to cost money, and it's also that there's not as many of those people as there are who can conduct a structured interview, which is far simpler. So a couple of serious practical factors there that mean that unstructured interviews are not the best method, not the strongest method. Ethically speaking, in terms of the morality of the research, it can be done in an ethical way. So obviously, if you're going to have a conversation, a discussion about a particular topic, you can give people fully informed consent. They know what you're going to be talking about. You can also, you've got to make sure that you keep things confidential, so you're not taking any private information and making it public. Making sure that they're kept anonymous. It is possible that there's a risk of harm, particularly if you're talking about sensitive topics. If we're doing something on domestic violence, for example, you've got to be very careful about how you handle that and how you interview a participant who's been through something like that. But the idea is, and the kind of strength here of an unstructured interview, is that you've got the opportunity to build a strong rapport. You build this bond of trust. You build a good quality relationship with the participant before you go ahead and start trying to ask the questions that you're actually interested in. So if you're dealing with a sensitive topic, you can help that person. You can build a good relationship with them, build a strong rapport, and you can even offer emotional and psychological support when discussing this stuff. So actually that means that it's a better method when dealing with sensitive topics than something like a structured interview, where you can't offer that kind of support for the participant. So the next issue we need to consider is all about reliability. So just to remind you, this is the factor to do with how easy it is to replicate the research, how easy it is to repeat it in the exact same way to see whether you get the exact same results. Now, with an unstructured interview, because it's like an informal conversation, because it can go in any different direction shaped by the participant, it's very, very difficult to ask the exact same questions in the exact same order, in the exact same way. With a structured interview, because they're written out on a list and they're set in stone, and you don't deviate from them, that's quite easy. Whereas an unstructured interview is very, very difficult. And what that means is unstructured interviews are not that reliable. On the other hand, though, they are quite valid. So there's a couple of different things that mean you're likely to get truthful, accurate results. Firstly, there's a lot more space for the participant to go into detail, to go into depth. And that means that they're able to fully express themselves. With a structured interview, they might have to choose between A, B, and C. They might have 3 options, or they might have to give a score out of 1 to 5. that's quite restricting. That doesn't allow a full depth and full detail to be explained, whereas an unstructured interview does. And on top of this, what happens with an unstructured interview is the participant can direct the conversation into the areas that they actually feel are important. When it's a questionnaire or when it's a structured interview and the research has just written a list of questions, those are the only questions you talk about. It's what the researcher thinks is important that gets researched. When it's an unstructured interview, the participant can actually open up new avenues that the researcher might not have even thought of and say, this is actually what's important, and express that well. So both of those things mean that unstructured interviews are actually really quite high in validity. You could definitely argue that a one-to-one situation would lead to social desirability, like the participant might feel that they're being interrogated rather than interviewed. And so they feel judged and under pressure to give socially desirable answers. So you could argue that they're less valid due to the social desirability factor. But because of the strong rapport, if an unstructured interview has been done correctly, what's going on is there's a close relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, and they feel comfortable and they feel like they can trust, and they know that they're not going to be judged, or they're not the data's going to stay private as well. What that means is they might be more likely to open up and be honest. So again, you could argue that part of an unstructured interview, that rapport, means that you're going to get more valid results. A weakness, though, of unstructured interviews is because they take such a long time to conduct. It generally means that there's only a handful of people involved. So there's a small sample, and that means that generally it's going to be unrepresentative. Okay, you compare that to a questionnaire where you're talking about thousands of people getting involved. That's pretty representative. When unstructured interviews, likely you're talking about dozens of people rather than hundreds or thousands. So unrepresentative is definitely a weakness of these unstructured interviews, but structured interviews and questionnaires tend to be larger samples, more representative. Finally, now we've got the theoretical issue. And this is whether it's something that positivists prefer or interpretivists prefer. Now, we've still got to do some work on this to fully understand the difference between these two. But for now, what I want you to be aware of and make a note of is that interpretivists find unstructured interviews really valuable. And the reason is that you're getting the in-depth qualitative data, and that allows you to fully understand the meanings that participants have in their heads. That's really important to the interpretivists. Now, the positivists disagree. They criticize this point of view. They think that actually unstructured interviews aren't helpful because they're too subjective. So the researcher might look at somebody's data, look at the responses to the question, and have a very different idea when another researcher looks at it. It's too subjective. They interpret it differently. Because they're not statistics, because they're not kind of factual in that way, they can be subjective. And that means they're unreliable. And so basically, because the positives are quite scientific, unstructured interviews aren't scientific enough. Final thing now we need to take a note of is some examples of unstructured interviews that you can use to support the kind of strengths and weaknesses that you're talking about. So the first one we've got here is Oakley from the family topic. She was interviewing women about how kind of equal their relationships are with their partners. And she went into the participants' homes. She sat in their kitchens, and she built a really positive relationship, a really strong rapport. She gave them lots of advice about marriage, about child rearing. She thought it was really important to give back to the participants, not just take. And you'll learn more about this when we get to the second year and we do theory and what's called the feminist methodology. And in fact, she had such a strong rapport with her participants that the women actually wanted her there in the room the next time they were given birth. So some of the participants were pregnant and they wanted her to be there as kind of like a birthing coach and an emotional support. And what that shows is that relationship is a really good bond of trust. So the idea of people telling the truth and opening up is going to be much higher, and therefore the validity is much higher. And you can use Oakley to support that. The other example we've got here is Dobash and Dobash. So again, talking about the family in particular, they were investigating domestic violence in the home and looking at how marriage kind of legitimates domestic violence. And what they did was unstructured interviews with 109 women and who were victims of domestic violence. If you wanted to do a questionnaire or a structured interview about a topic like domestic violence, it just wouldn't be appropriate. It would be unethical. The fact that they're able to be there with them to offer emotional support, to offer psychological support in a kind of non-threatening and helpful way, supportive way, because you're talking about really horrible memories that could cause damage to participants, just bringing them up without doing it in a safe environment. So Dobash and Dobash can be used to highlight the kind of more supportive, ethical side of it when it's a sensitive topic. So 2 examples there that you need to make note of, and then you need to go away and try and get the quiz questions correct. And I will see you for the next one next time.